The scream cut through the winter night like a knife through bone, and Lucas Thorne dropped his saddle without thinking, his boots already pounding across the frozen ground toward the burning barn that lit up the December sky like a funeral pyre. The year was 1881, and Cripple Creek, Colorado, had seen its share of hard winters, but this one threatened to be the worst yet. Lucas had arrived in town 3 weeks earlier, a drifter cowboy with nowhere particular to go and nothing particular to lose. He had taken work at the Davidson Ranch, grateful for the warmth of the bunkhouse and the steady meals, even if the pay was modest. Tonight he had been tending to his gear in the stable when he heard it, that terrible sound of someone trapped and terrified. The barn belonged to the Johnsons, the family that owned the boarding house where Lucas took his occasional hot bath and decent supper when he had coin to spare. Katherine Johnson was 22 years old, unmarried, and by all accounts the most capable woman in Cripple Creek. She ran the boarding house mostly by herself, since her father had died 2 years back, her mother too frail to do much more than sit by the fire and mend linens. Lucas had spoken to Katherine perhaps a dozen times, brief exchanges about payment or meal times, but he had noticed her the way any man with eyes would notice her. She had dark hair that she kept pinned up tight, green eyes that missed nothing, and a way of moving through the world that suggested she feared very little. Now she was screaming, and Lucas was running. The heat hit him like a physical blow when he was still 20 feet from the barn. The structure was old, the wood dry despite the snow that covered the ground around it. Someone had knocked over a lantern, he would learn later. Katherine had gone in to check on the horses when the wind caught the door and slammed it shut behind her. The latch had fallen into place, trapping her inside. By the time she smelled the smoke, the flames had already climbed the walls. Lucas did not hesitate. He pulled his coat up over his mouth and nose, lowered his head, and ran straight into the inferno. The smoke was blinding, thick and black and choking. He could hear the horses screaming somewhere deeper in the barn, could hear Katherine coughing and calling for help. The heat was incredible, pressing against him from all sides, singeing the hair on his arms and making his eyes water until he could barely see. He moved by instinct, following the sound of her voice. He found her near the back, pressed against the wall where she had retreated from the advancing flames. Her dress was singed, her face streaked with soot and tears. When she saw him emerge from the smoke, her eyes went wide with something between hope and disbelief. "Can you walk?" He shouted over the roar of the fire. "Yes," she gasped. "But the door—" "Forget the door," he said and grabbed her hand. "We go through the window." There was a small window high up on the eastern wall, too high for Katherine to reach alone but just possible if Lucas lifted her. He pulled her across the barn, dodging falling embers and burning beams. His lungs felt like they were full of glass. Behind them, part of the roof collapsed with a sound like thunder. "When I lift you up, you break that glass with your elbow and climb through," he told her. "Do not wait for me. You run as far from this barn as you can." "What about you?" she demanded, and even through the smoke and terror, there was fire in her eyes that had nothing to do with the flames around them. "I will be right behind you," he promised. He lifted her, his hands around her waist, pushing her up toward the window. She was stronger than she looked, pulling herself up with determination, smashing through the glass with her arm wrapped in her shawl. For a moment she was silhouetted against the winter night sky, and then she was gone. Lucas took 2 steps back, then ran at the wall and jumped, catching the windowsill with his fingers. His shoulders screamed in protest as he hauled himself up and through the narrow opening. He felt glass tear through his shirt and into his skin, but he did not stop. He tumbled through and fell hard into the snow outside, rolling away from the building instinctively. Katherine was there immediately, her hands on his face, checking him for injuries. "You are bleeding," she said, her voice shaking. "Just scratches," he managed, though his whole body felt like one large bruise. Behind them, the barn groaned and then collapsed entirely, sending a shower of sparks up into the dark sky. The snow around it melted in a wide circle, revealing the frozen mud beneath. People were running toward them now, townspeople roused by the fire and the shouting. Someone threw a blanket around Katherine's shoulders. Someone else helped Lucas to his feet. But he found he could not look away from Katherine, and she could not look away from him. "You ran into a burning building," she said, as if she could not quite believe it. "You were inside it," he replied, as if that explained everything. Perhaps it did. The doctor checked them both over in the boarding-house parlor while Katherine's mother wept with relief, and half the town crowded in to hear what had happened. Lucas had burns on his hands and arms, cuts from the glass, and lungs full of smoke, but nothing that would not heal. Katherine was in better shape, having been trapped for a shorter time. She had refused to go upstairs and rest, insisting on staying in the parlor to make sure Lucas was all right. "You saved my life," she said to him when the crowd had finally dispersed, and it was just the two of them sitting by the fire, cups of coffee growing cold in their hands. "Anyone would have done the same," Lucas said, though they both knew that was not true. Several men had been closer to the barn than he was, but they had stood frozen, watching the flames. "No," Katherine said firmly, "they would not have." She looked at him for a long moment, studying his face as if memorizing it. "Why did you do it?" Lucas considered the question. He was not a man given to introspection or flowery words. He dealt with horses and cattle, with long days in the saddle and longer nights under the stars. But something about the way Katherine looked at him demanded honesty. "Because the thought of you dying in there was worse than the thought of dying myself trying to save you," he said. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning neither of them was quite ready to examine. Katherine's cheeks flushed, and she looked down at her hands. "That is quite possibly the most ridiculous and the most wonderful thing anyone has ever said to me," she murmured. Lucas felt his own face grow warm. "I should go," he said, starting to stand. "Let you rest." "Wait." Katherine's hand shot out and caught his wrist. Her touch was gentle but firm. "Stay a while longer, please." So he stayed. They talked through the night, their voices low so as not to wake Katherine's mother sleeping upstairs. Lucas told her about his life, about growing up on a small ranch in Texas, about losing his parents to fever when he was 17, about the years he had spent drifting from town to town looking for something he could not name. Katherine told him about her father, about how proud he had been of the boarding house, about how she was determined to keep it running no matter how hard the work became. She told him about the loneliness of being a woman in charge in a place where most people thought women belonged in the kitchen or the bedroom and nowhere else. "Do you ever think about leaving?" Lucas asked. "Going somewhere easier?" "Every single day," Katherine admitted, "but this is home. My father built this house with his own hands. My mother's whole life is here. I cannot just abandon it." She paused, then added quietly, "Besides, where would I go? A woman alone has few options." "You are not alone," Lucas said, and was surprised by the intensity in his own voice. "Not anymore." Katherine looked at him, and something shifted in her expression, something that made Lucas's heart beat faster. "No," she agreed softly. "I suppose I am not." When dawn broke over Cripple Creek, painting the snow-covered mountains pink and gold, Lucas finally left the boarding house and walked back to the Davidson ranch. His body ached, his hands were wrapped in bandages, and his clothes reeked of smoke. But he felt more alive than he had in years. The problem, he realized as he trudged through the snow, was that he was falling in love with Katherine Johnson, and he had nothing to offer her. He was a cowboy with no land, no money, and no prospects beyond the next day's work. She was a woman of property and standing in the community, even if that property was currently reduced by one barn. What could he possibly give her that she did not already have or could not get for herself? But when he showed up at the boarding house 3 days later with his hat in his hands and asked if he could take her to the church social on Saturday, she said yes, without hesitation. The church social was held in the meeting hall, a drafty building that the ladies of the town had done their best to warm up with candles and carefully hoarded decorations. Lucas wore his best shirt, the one without any holes, and boots he had polished until they shone. Katherine wore a dress of deep blue wool that brought out her eyes, and she had done something different with her hair, leaving a few curls loose to frame her face. They were the subject of considerable attention. Everyone in Cripple Creek had heard the story of the barn fire by now, and the tale had grown in the telling. In some versions, Lucas had fought his way through walls of solid flame. In others, he had carried Katherine out in his arms while the roof collapsed around them. The truth was dramatic enough, but people did love a good story. "They are all staring at us," Katherine murmured as they entered the hall. "Let them stare," Lucas said and offered her his arm. They ate cake and drank punch, and Lucas endured the claps on his back from men who called him a hero. He did not feel like a hero. He had simply done what needed doing. But he smiled and nodded and thanked them, and tried not to notice the way some of the older women were looking at Katherine with calculation in their eyes, as if they were already planning a wedding. When the music started, he asked her to dance. "I should warn you," Lucas said as they took their positions, "I am not much of a dancer." "Neither am I," Katherine admitted. "We shall stumble through it together." But they did not stumble. Lucas found that with Katherine in his arms, moving to the music came naturally. They swayed together to the fiddle and the guitar, and the rest of the room seemed to fade away until there was nothing but the two of them and the melody. "I have been thinking," Katherine said quietly, her eyes on his chest rather than his face, "about what you said that night, about me not being alone." "Yes." Lucas's voice was rough. "Did you mean it?" She looked up at him now, and her gaze was searching. "Or was it just something you said in the moment?" "I meant it," Lucas said firmly. "Every word." "Good," Katherine said and smiled. "Because I have been alone for a very long time, Lucas Thorne, and I find I do not want to be alone anymore." "Neither do I," he admitted. The song ended, but they stayed where they were for a moment longer, reluctant to break apart. Then someone was calling for the next dance, and the spell was broken. But something had been decided between them, something important that did not need to be spoken aloud. The winter deepened, and Lucas found himself spending more and more time at the boarding house. He helped Katherine with repairs, using his carpentry skills to fix a sagging porch step and replace warped floorboards. He chopped wood for the stove until there was enough stacked to last through 2 winters. He made himself useful in 100 small ways, and Katherine let him, her gratitude evident in her smiles, and in the way she always made sure he had the best portions at supper. They courted properly, as was expected, with Katherine's mother acting as chaperone. But there were stolen moments, brief touches of hands when passing in the hallway, long looks across the dinner table that said more than words ever could. Lucas learned that Katherine loved to read but rarely had time for it. He borrowed books from the small lending library above the general store and brought them to her, watching her face light up with each new title. Katherine learned that Lucas had a gift with horses, and a surprising gentleness with creatures that had been mistreated. She watched him gentle, a skittish mare that had been beaten by its previous owner, his patience and kindness transforming the animal from terrified to trusting over the course of weeks. "You have a good heart," she told him one evening in February. They were sitting in the parlor, Katherine mending a shirt while Lucas carved a small wooden figure by the fire. Her mother had fallen asleep in her chair, snoring gently. "So do you," Lucas said. "We make a good pair then," Katherine said lightly, but there was weight behind the words. Lucas set down his carving and looked at her. "Katherine," he began, then stopped, unsure how to continue. She set down her mending and met his eyes. "Yes, I do not have much," he said honestly. "I have been saving my wages, but it is not enough for land or a house. I cannot offer you anything close to what you deserve." "What do I deserve?" Katherine asked quietly. "Everything," Lucas said with feeling. "You deserve a man who can give you security and comfort and a life free from worry." "That is a lovely thought," Katherine said. "But what I actually want is a man who would run into a burning building for me, a man who treats me as an equal, a man who makes me laugh and who listens when I speak, a man who sees me as I am and values that." She paused. "I want you, Lucas. I do not need anything else." Lucas crossed the room in 3 strides and knelt beside her chair. He took her hand in both of his, mindful of the scars from the fire that still marked his skin. "Katherine Johnson," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears welled in Katherine's eyes, but she was smiling. "Yes," she said. "Yes, absolutely yes." In the chair by the fire, Katherine's mother opened one eye and smiled before closing it again and resuming her gentle snoring. They were married in March in the little church at the edge of town. The wedding was small, just a handful of friends and townspeople, but it felt perfect to Lucas. Katherine wore a dress of cream-colored silk that she had sewn herself, working late into the nights to finish it in time. Lucas wore a new suit that he had spent nearly all his savings on, wanting to look his best for her. When the preacher asked if he took Katherine to be his wife, Lucas said, "I do," with absolute certainty. When Katherine repeated the words back to him, her voice was strong and clear. They exchanged simple gold bands, and when the preacher told Lucas he could kiss his bride, he did so with a tenderness that made several of the women in attendance dab at their eyes with handkerchiefs. They held a small reception at the boarding house, with food that Katherine and some of the neighbor women had prepared. There was music and dancing and laughter, and for a few hours, the hardships of frontier life seemed very far away. Lucas danced with his wife, marveling at the word. His wife. Katherine Thorne. She was his, and he was hers, and nothing in his entire life had ever felt so right. That night, after the guests had gone and Katherine's mother had retired to her room, Lucas carried Katherine up the stairs to the room they would now share. He set her down gently, as if she were made of something precious and breakable, though he knew she was neither. "Hello, husband," Katherine said, her eyes sparkling. "Hello, wife," Lucas replied and kissed her. They came together with a passion and a tenderness that surprised them both. Lucas had known women before, brief encounters in saloons or hastily arranged meetings in barn lofts. But this was different. This was not just physical desire, though that was certainly present. This was love, pure and consuming, expressed through touch and whispered words and the joining of 2 people who had chosen each other against all odds. Afterwards, they lay tangled together under the quilts, Katherine's head on Lucas's chest, his arms around her. "Are you happy?" Lucas asked, stroking her hair. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Katherine admitted. "Are you?" "More than I can say," Lucas told her truthfully. They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, and when morning came, they woke to their first full day as husband and wife. Life settled into a new rhythm after the wedding. Lucas continued his work at the Davidson Ranch, but now he came home each night to a wife and a home that was truly his. Katherine continued running the boarding house with Lucas's help, and together they began to build something more than either of them had alone. They made plans for the future, talking late into the night about what they wanted their life to look like. "I want to rebuild the barn," Katherine said one evening in April. The snow was finally melting, revealing the muddy ground and the blackened ruins of the structure that had brought them together. "That will take money," Lucas said cautiously. They were not poor, but they were far from wealthy either. "I know," Katherine said, "but I have been thinking. We have the boarding house, which brings in steady income. You have your wages. If we are careful, if we save and plan, we could do it. Not right away, but eventually." "What would we use it for?" Lucas asked. "Horses," Katherine said, her eyes bright with excitement. "You have such a gift with them, Lucas. I have seen the way you work with even the most difficult animals. We could breed and train horses, sell them to ranchers and the army. There is good money in it if it is done right." Lucas considered this. It was true that he had always felt more comfortable with horses than with people. The idea of building something of his own, of working with Katherine toward a shared goal, appealed to him enormously. "All right," he said. "We will do it, together." Katherine threw her arms around his neck and kissed him soundly. "Together," she agreed. They began saving in earnest, cutting expenses where they could and setting aside every spare penny. Lucas took on extra work when he could find it, and Katherine expanded the boarding house's offerings to include laundry services for the miners and ranch hands who had no one to do their washing. It was hard work, exhausting work, but they did it with willing hearts because they could see their dreams slowly taking shape. In May, Katherine discovered she was pregnant. She told Lucas over breakfast on a Sunday morning, her hands trembling slightly as she poured his coffee. "I have news," she said simply. Lucas looked up from his plate, taking in her nervous excitement. "What is it? We are going to have a baby," Katherine said. "In December, the doctor thinks." For a moment, Lucas could not speak. He had hoped for children eventually, but he had not expected it to happen so soon. Joy and terror warred within him. A baby. He was going to be a father. "Lucas," Katherine's voice was uncertain now. "Say something." He stood up so fast his chair nearly toppled over, and then he was across the room, pulling her into his arms. "That is wonderful," he said fiercely. "You are wonderful. This is the best news I have ever received." Katherine sagged against him in relief. "I was worried," she admitted. "I know we did not plan for this so soon, and money is tight. We will manage," Lucas interrupted. "We will make it work, Katherine. We will give this child everything it needs." "I know we will," Katherine said and kissed him. The pregnancy was not easy. Katherine suffered from terrible nausea in the early months, barely able to keep food down. Lucas worried constantly, hovering over her until she laughingly told him to stop fussing. As summer wore on, the heat made everything worse, and Katherine's energy waned. But she refused to slow down, insisting on continuing her work at the boarding house even when Lucas begged her to rest. "I am pregnant, not dying," she told him firmly. "Women have been having babies while working since the beginning of time. I will be fine." And she was fine, mostly. But Lucas could see the toll it took on her, the way she grew more tired as the months passed, the way she had to sit down more often and catch her breath. He took on as much of her work as he could, learning to cook and clean and manage the boarding house guests even as he continued his ranch work. By September, Katherine was noticeably round, her belly swelling with their growing child. She glowed with health despite her tiredness, and Lucas thought she had never been more beautiful. He found himself constantly amazed by what her body was doing, by the fact that they had created a life together. It moved, Katherine said one night in October, grabbing Lucas's hand and pressing it to her stomach. Do you feel it? Lucas held his breath, waiting. And then he felt it, a small flutter against his palm like a butterfly's wings. His child, moving inside his wife. Tears sprang to his eyes before he could stop them. That is our baby, he said wonderingly. That is our baby, Katherine confirmed, her own eyes wet. They held each other close, Lucas's hand still on her belly, feeling the occasional movements of the life they had made together. Winter came early that year, with snow falling in November and temperatures dropping rapidly. Lucas worked frantically to ensure the boarding house was ready, that there was enough wood and food stored to last through the cold months. He was terrified of something going wrong, of Katherine or the baby being in danger, and him not being able to help. You cannot protect us from everything, Katherine told him gently one night when he confessed his fears. Bad things happen sometimes. All we can do is love each other and face whatever comes together. I know, Lucas said, but I would if I could, protect you from everything, I mean. I know you would, Katherine said. That is one of the reasons I love you so much. The baby came on a cold December night, exactly 1 year after the barn fire that had brought Lucas and Katherine together. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Lucas thought he might die from sheer terror. He had faced down angry bulls and broken horses and burning buildings, but nothing had prepared him for the helplessness of listening to his wife cry out in pain and being unable to do anything to stop it. But Katherine was strong, stronger than he had known. She labored through the night with the doctor and the midwife in attendance, and when dawn broke, she gave a final push and brought their son into the world. Lucas heard the baby cry before he saw him, a loud, angry sound that was the most beautiful thing he had ever heard. The midwife cleaned the infant and wrapped him in a blanket, then placed him carefully in Katherine's arms. You have a son, she said, smiling. Lucas moved to Katherine's side, looking down at the tiny red-faced creature in her arms. He was perfect, with a shock of dark hair and tiny fists that waved in the air. As Lucas watched, the baby opened his eyes and looked directly at him, and Lucas felt something in his chest crack wide open. Hello, little one, Katherine murmured, her voice exhausted but full of love. Welcome to the world. He is beautiful, Lucas said, his voice thick with emotion, just like his mother. They named him James after Katherine's father, James Thorne, born December 15, 1882. He was healthy and loud and demanded attention at all hours, and Lucas and Katherine fell in love with him immediately and completely. The first months of parenthood were exhausting. James woke frequently through the night, needing to be fed or changed or simply held. Katherine was recovering from the birth, tired and sore but determined to care for her son herself. Lucas helped as much as he could, walking the floor with James when he fussed, changing diapers with clumsy but willing hands, and taking over the boarding house duties so Katherine could rest. I never knew it was possible to be this tired and this happy at the same time, Katherine said one morning in February, bouncing a fussy James on her hip while trying to scramble eggs one-handed. Here, let me, Lucas said, taking the baby. James immediately settled against his father's chest, his crying subsiding to small hiccups. Lucas had discovered that the baby loved to be held close and walked around, the motion soothing him in a way that nothing else quite managed. He loves you, Katherine observed, smiling. The feeling is mutual, Lucas said, pressing a kiss to James's downy head. As winter gave way to spring, they returned to their plan for the barn and the horse breeding business. It would take longer now with a baby to care for, but they were still determined. Lucas had been setting aside money steadily, and Katherine had been careful with the boarding house finances. By the time James was 6 months old, they had enough saved to begin. The work of rebuilding the barn took the entire summer. Lucas did most of the physical labor himself with help from some of the ranch hands he had befriended. Katherine managed the finances and the ordering of supplies and helped when she could, though most of her time was taken up with caring for James. The baby was growing rapidly, becoming more alert and interactive with each passing day. He had his mother's green eyes and his father's stubborn chin, and he smiled easily at anyone who paid him attention. The barn was finished in September, a solid structure that was better built than the original had been. Lucas had been careful about fire safety this time, keeping lanterns in secure places and making sure there were multiple exits. He never wanted anyone to be trapped the way Katherine had been. They bought their first 2 mares in October, gentle creatures that Lucas chose carefully for their temperament and bloodlines. He also acquired a stallion, a beautiful black beast with good conformation and a surprisingly gentle nature. Katherine helped him care for them, learning about horses with the same determination she brought to everything else. "We are really doing this," she said one evening, standing with Lucas at the paddock fence and watching the horses graze in the autumn twilight. James was asleep in a sling on her chest, his head lolling against her. "We are," Lucas agreed, sliding an arm around her waist and pulling her close. "You, me, and James, building something that will last." "I like the sound of that," Katherine murmured. The business grew slowly but steadily. Lucas's reputation as a horseman spread, and people began coming to him to train difficult animals or to purchase horses he had bred and raised. The income was modest at first, but it supplemented what they made from the boarding house and Lucas's ranch work. They were not wealthy, but they were comfortable, and more importantly, they were happy. James grew from a baby into a toddler, walking at 10 months and talking by 15 months. He was a bright, curious child who followed Lucas around like a small shadow whenever his father was home. Lucas taught him about horses, letting him feed them carrots with careful supervision and showing him how to brush their coats gently. James absorbed it all with wide eyes and endless questions. When James was 2 years old, Katherine became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect or perhaps just by luck. She continued working through most of it, though Lucas insisted she slow down more than she had with James. Their second child, a daughter they named Sarah, was born in the spring of 1885. Sarah was different from James from the very beginning. Where James had been loud and demanding, Sarah was quiet and watchful. She had her father's dark hair and a serious expression that made her look wise beyond her infant years. James was fascinated by his baby sister, always wanting to hold her or help care for her, and Katherine and Lucas marveled at their growing family. "2 children," Lucas said wonderingly one night, watching Katherine nurse Sarah while James slept between them. "When I came to Cripple Creek, I had nothing and no one. Now I have everything." "We have everything," Katherine corrected gently. "This life we have built, we built it together." "Together," Lucas agreed, and leaned over to kiss her forehead. The years passed in a blur of hard work and simple joys. The horse business continued to grow, until Lucas was able to leave his ranch work and focus on it full time. They bred and trained horses that became known throughout Colorado for their quality and temperament. Ranchers came from as far as Denver to buy Lucas Thorne's horses. The boarding house remained profitable, with Katherine managing it with efficiency and warmth, making it a place where people felt welcomed and cared for. James and Sarah grew, becoming sturdy children who helped with the horses and the boarding house as soon as they were old enough. James inherited his father's gift with animals. while Sarah showed a head for numbers that suggested she would one day run the business side of things. Katherine's mother passed peacefully in her sleep when James was 5, and though they grieved, they were grateful she had lived to see her grandchildren. Lucas and Katherine's love for each other only deepened with time. They still stole moments alone when they could, still looked at each other across rooms with the same warmth they had felt in those early days. They argued occasionally, as any couple did, but they always came back to each other, always remembered what they meant to one another. On a December evening in 1890, 9 years after the fire that had brought them together, Lucas and Katherine stood in the barn watching the snow fall outside. The building was warm and well lit, full of horses contentedly eating their evening hay. James and Sarah were in the house with a neighbor who was watching them, giving Lucas and Katherine a rare evening alone. "Do you remember this night 9 years ago?" Katherine asked, leaning against Lucas's side. "I remember every detail," Lucas said. "The sound of your scream, the heat of the fire, how terrified I was that I would not reach you in time." "You saved my life that night," Katherine said softly. "You saved mine too," Lucas said. "Maybe not from a fire, but from a life of loneliness and aimlessness. You gave me purpose, Katherine. You gave me everything." Katherine turned to face him, reaching up to cup his cheek with her hand. "We saved each other," she said, "and we built this beautiful life together." Lucas kissed her then, slow and sweet, and when they pulled apart they were both smiling. "I love you," he said. "I will love you until the day I die and beyond." "I love you too," Katherine replied. "Always." They stood together in the barn that had once nearly been Katherine's tomb but was now a symbol of everything they had built, everything they had become. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing Cripple Creek in white, but inside they were warm and safe and together. The years continued to unfold with their share of hardships and triumphs. When James was 8, he broke his arm falling from a tree, and Lucas and Katherine took turns sitting up with him through the pain-filled night. When Sarah was 7, she won the spelling bee at the small school that had finally been built in Cripple Creek, and her parents swelled with pride. The horse business had its ups and downs, years when they barely broke even and years when they prospered. But through it all, Lucas and Katherine faced everything as they had promised together. They added on to the barn twice as the business expanded, building additional stalls and a separate training area. Lucas hired 2 young men to help with the work, teaching them the same patience and care with horses that he employed. Katherine eventually handed over the day-to-day management of the boarding house to a capable widow who needed the work and income, though she still kept the books and made the major decisions. When James was 12, he asked if he could start training horses himself, and Lucas agreed, carefully supervising as his son worked with a young gelding that needed gentling. James had his father's touch, and within weeks, the horse was following him around like a devoted dog. Sarah, meanwhile, had taken over keeping the breeding records and tracking the finances, her neat handwriting filling ledgers with careful precision. "They are good children," Katherine said to Lucas one evening, watching James and Sarah work together to groom one of the mares. "We did something right. We did everything right," Lucas said, pulling her close. "Look at this life we have, Katherine. Look at what we made." She looked, and she saw her children healthy and happy, saw the successful business they had built from nothing, saw the comfortable home they had created. But most of all, she saw Lucas, her husband, her partner, her love. The man who had run through flames for her and had spent every day since proving that he would do it again and again if needed. "It is a good life," she agreed. "The very best." More years passed. James grew into a tall, capable young man who courted and eventually married the daughter of a neighboring rancher. Sarah, showing no interest in marriage yet, took over more and more of the business operations, her sharp mind making the horse breeding venture more profitable than it had ever been. Lucas and Katherine became grandparents when James and his wife had a son, and they delighted in the new role, spoiling the baby in the way grandparents always did. Lucas's hair turned gray at the temples, and lines appeared at the corners of Katherine's eyes, but to each other they were still the same people who had found each other in fire and smoke all those years ago. They still walked together in the evenings, still talked for hours about everything and nothing, still reached for each other in the night. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Lucas took Katherine back to the church where they had married. It was a spring day, warm and bright, with wildflowers blooming across the meadows. They stood together at the altar where they had exchanged their vows 2 decades earlier. "If I had to do it all over again, I would not change a single thing," Lucas said, taking Katherine's hands in his. "You are the best decision I ever made." "Running into that burning barn was the best decision you ever made," Katherine corrected with a smile. "I was just the happy result." "No," Lucas said seriously. "Loving you was the decision. The barn was just the beginning. Every day since I have chosen you, and I will keep choosing you for as long as I live." Tears streamed down Katherine's face, but she was smiling. "I choose you too," she said. "Every single day. Forever." They renewed their vows there in the empty church, speaking the same words they had spoken 20 years earlier, meaning them even more deeply now with all the years and experience between them. When they kissed, it was with the passion of new lovers and the comfort of old friends, all mixed together into something that was uniquely theirs. As they grew older, Lucas and Katherine gradually stepped back from the business, letting James and Sarah take over more of the responsibilities. They still helped when needed, still offered advice when asked, but mostly they enjoyed the fruits of their decades of labor. They traveled occasionally, taking the train to Denver or Colorado Springs, seeing the parts of the world they had never had time for when they were younger. But they always came home to Cripple Creek, to the boarding house and the barn and the mountains that surrounded them. This was where their story had begun, where they had built their life, and it was where they belonged. Lucas was 65 years old when he fell ill with pneumonia one brutal winter. For days he burned with fever while Katherine sat by his bedside, holding his hand and willing him to fight. James and Sarah came with their own families, filling the house with worried faces and whispered prayers. The doctor was not optimistic, warning Katherine to prepare for the worst, but Lucas was not ready to leave yet. He fought his way back from the edge of death with the same determination he had shown running into that burning barn 40 years earlier. When his fever finally broke and he opened his eyes to find Katherine watching over him, his first words were, "I am still here." "Thank God," Katherine said, and burst into tears. Lucas recovered slowly, his body weakened by the illness. But with Katherine's care and his own stubborn will, he regained his strength. The scare reminded them both how precious their time together was, how quickly it could all end. They held each other a little tighter after that, said, "I love you" a little more often, made sure every day counted. They were blessed with many grandchildren, and later, great-grandchildren. The house was often full of the sounds of children playing, and Lucas took the same patient care with teaching them about horses that he had taken with James and Sarah years before. Katherine baked cookies and told stories, and both of them reveled in the chaos and joy that a large family brought. Lucas and Katherine celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary surrounded by 3 generations of family, in the same boarding house where they had held their wedding reception. The building had been expanded and renovated over the years, but the heart of it remained the same. Lucas, now 72 but still standing straight and tall, took Catherine's hand and led her in a slow dance to the same songs they had danced to all those decades ago. 50 years, Katherine marveled, her head resting on Lucas's shoulder. It went so fast. And yet I remember every moment, Lucas said. Every joy, every hardship, every ordinary day, all of it with you. All of it with you, Katherine echoed. They danced until the music ended, and then they stood together, surrounded by the family they had created, the life they had built. Lucas looked at his wife, still beautiful to him despite the silver in her hair and the lines time had etched on her face, and he thought about that winter night so long ago when he had run into the flames to save her. He had thought he was saving her life that night, but really, she had saved his. She had given him purpose and love, and a reason to be more than just a drifting cowboy with nothing to his name. She had given him children and grandchildren, a business and a home, 50 years of partnership and devotion. They had built something remarkable together, something that would outlast them both. The horses they bred would carry their legacy. The children and grandchildren they loved would remember them. The life they had shared would echo through the generations. But more than any of that, they had loved each other with a fierce and abiding devotion that had weathered every storm and celebrated every triumph. They had been partners in the truest sense, equals who built their life together brick by brick, day by day. As the party continued around them, Lucas leaned down and kissed his wife, and Katherine kissed him back. And in that moment, they were not old but young again, standing in the boarding house parlor 49 years earlier, newly engaged and full of hope for the future. That hope had been rewarded 1,000 times over. They lived several more years, each day a gift they did not take for granted. Lucas's health was never quite the same after the pneumonia, but he was content, spending his days in the sun watching the horses graze and playing with great-grandchildren who climbed on his lap to hear stories about the old days. Katherine remained sharp as ever, managing the boarding house books until the very end and keeping the entire extended family organized with her careful planning and warm affection. She still made sure Lucas took his medicine and ate properly, still fussed over him the way she had for 50 years. On a quiet evening in late autumn, Lucas and Katherine sat together on the porch of the boarding house, wrapped in blankets against the chill. The sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. Inside, they could hear the sounds of family, James and his wife preparing dinner while grandchildren ran through the halls playing some game that involved a lot of shouting and laughter. "It was a good life," Lucas said quietly, his hand finding Katherine's beneath the blankets. "The very best," Katherine agreed, lacing her fingers through his. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sunset and listening to the sounds of the family they had created. There was nothing more that needed to be said. They had said it all over 50 years of living and loving together, of building something beautiful from the ashes of that terrible fire. As darkness fell and stars began to appear in the sky, they went inside together, hand in hand, to join their family for dinner. There was love in that house, and laughter, and the kind of contentment that came from a life well lived. Lucas Thorne had been a drifter once, a man with nothing and no one, wandering from place to place looking for something he could not name. But he had found it in a burning barn in Cripple Creek, Colorado, in the form of a woman with green eyes and a fierce determination to live. He had run through flames to save Katherine Johnson, and in doing so, he had saved himself. They had built a life together that exceeded anything either of them could have imagined that winter night in 1881. A life full of love and family and honest work, of challenges overcome and dreams realized. They had loved each other with everything they had, and that love had been returned 1,000-fold. As they sat down to dinner surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, Lucas looked across the table at Katherine and smiled, and she smiled back. And in that smile was contained all the years and all the love they had shared. It was, in every possible way, a life worth living, a love worth having, a story worth telling. And when their time finally came, years later, they went peacefully, knowing they had loved completely and been loved in return, which is all anyone can really hope for in this world. The boarding house and the horse breeding business continued on through their children and grandchildren, a living legacy of what Lucas and Katherine Thorne had built together. But more than buildings or businesses, they left behind the memory of a love that had endured through decades, a partnership that had weathered every storm, and the example of two people who had chosen each other again and again, every single day, from that first moment in the flames until their very last breath. And in Cripple Creek, Colorado, people still told the story of the cowboy who ran through flames to save the woman he loved, and how that moment of courage had been just the beginning of something beautiful that lasted a lifetime.